Today I'm going to demonstrate the 4 techniques that are used in the Hello Sunshine shawl pattern, which is our featured knit along for late summer. The first technique is going to be the slip stitch edge. Because the entire shawl is worked in garter stitch, there is a little slip stitch edge which gets rid of the unsightly bumps that you sometimes find annoying when you're doing straight knitting on every row. So the slip stitch edge creates this nice flat, even effect, and it also creates quite a bit of stretch. So that is explained in the pattern, but I'm just going to go over that first with you so you feel a little bit more familiar with it. So generally when we work in garter stitch, we knit one row, turn, knit the second row. To create the slip stitch edge, we are going to slip the first stitch knitways from the left needle to the right needle, and then knit to the very last stitch in the pattern. They will remind you what to do on the appropriate rows. So there is a slip stitch edge created at the bottom of the shawl and also at the top of the shawl. So I'm going to work to the last stitch and then I'm going to do a purl one. And that is your edge stitch. Okay, so I'm purling the last stitch as the directions require me to do so. And then when I turn the work, I'm going to slip the first stitch. Now some of you have already done this technique in garter stitch and you may be slipping it purlways. That's entirely fine too. I just find with the stretch factor of this yarn being extra fine merino, it is very, very resilient and bouncy. So I like to have that little twist in the edge instead of the flat slip stitch, which has a little bit more of a wider effect. As long as you are consistent, it doesn't really matter. If you start slipping the first stitch purlways, continue to do so for the entire project. If you choose to slip the first stitch knitways, which is my preference, and I can explain a bit more why I choose it to be knitways. And yes, so just be consistent. So I'm slipping one knitways. And if you can see the edge here, this is the bump we're trying to avoid. That's what happens when you do garter stitch across and back. There's a little nub. By doing the slip stitch, it's very flat and it has a bit more stretch. Okay, so that is technique number 1. I'll go over that a bit more during our knit along live videos every Friday. And technique number 2 is listed in your abbreviations as CDD, capital CDD, which is the centered double decrease. So the centered double decrease is taking away 2 stitches, and the instructions ask you to slip a stitch. So we are slipping it knitways, and then we're knitting the next 2 stitches together. So you've gotten rid of 1 stitch. Now we're going to slip the slip stitch over, and that gets rid of 2 stitches. That keeps the decrease nice and centered, and as you go through the shawl panel, you'll notice there is a nice center line or a spine forming. Okay, so the reason I prefer to slip knitways at the beginning of the row instead of purlways is because that reminds me to slip knitways when I do the CDD, the centered double decrease. Just a little bit easier on our brains if we can keep it uniform. So I will try one more across the row. Okay, when the pattern tells me to, I'm going to slip the next stitch knitways from the left to the right needle, and then I'm going to knit the next two together, and then I'm going to pass a slip stitch over the two together. There. It's not necessary to snug this up and make it too tight, because when you work back on your wrong side row, you'll knit across and the stitches will come a little bit closer together. So let them relax and the next row does the tightening up. Okay, so those centered double decreases are going to happen only on your right side rows. So it is important that you place a marker to remind you which is the right side of your work, because of course garter stitch looks the same on both sides. So I'm going to work one wrong side row, starting with a slip one knitways, knit to the last stitch and purl. And then we'll move on to the third technique, which is our CDI, also known as centered double increase, and it is listed also on your abbreviation pattern page. And for those of you who have knit shawls, you probably are familiar with this method of increasing. Okay, so I'm back to my right side row, ready to demonstrate the centered double increase. Oops, forgot to slip my first stitch. I was in a race to get to the increase. Okay, so wherever the pattern tells you to make an increase, how about here? So the first increase we're going to try is make one right, also known as M1R. And to do so, we use the left needle, pick up the horizontal bar between the two stitches from back to front. It's very important the direction you pick it up. Okay, so with the left needle I'm going under, back to front. And then with my right needle I'm going to knit into the front of the stitch, just as I would any regular knit stitch. That creates an invisible increase that neatly sits between two existing stitches. And then in your abbreviation it will ask you to knit one, which becomes your center spine stitch to separate the two types of increases. And now we're going to demonstrate the next increase, which is M1L, also known as make one left. So I'm going to use my right needle from back to front. I pick up the horizontal bar and place it on my left needle. It doesn't matter which way you get it on your left needle, as long as the left needle goes through the front of the bar, not the back. And then I'm going to knit through the back of the bar. So we've done make one right, knit one, make one left. And we'll try it again. And I will show you the little trick that I use to remind myself, make one right and make one left. Just to remind myself of the different directions. It is a directional increase, and it slants to the right for a reason, it slants to the left for a reason. Okay, so to remind myself of make one right, I'm going back to front under the horizontal bar, and my needle tip that I'm knitting with is positioned to the right when I insert it into the stitch. So I remind myself make one right is pointing the needle to the right. And then we knit one in the center for our spine stitch. The make one left, I place it on my left needle from front to back, and my needle point is knitting through the back, and I am reminded that it's make one left because the needle is knitting to the left. Nice and simple, but a very, very effective increase technique. And as I mentioned, you'll see it on many different shawl designs. You'll get very comfortable doing it because you're going to be doing it every right side row for your shawl project in this knit along. Okay, and then the last technique I want to show you is the short row method. So in the pattern, the suggested short row method is WNT, also known as wrap and turn. For those of you who are familiar with it, you'll know that it is a bit fiddly and it has a few extra steps to it than some of the other short row methods. The simplest short row method and the most pleasing aesthetically is the German short row method. So I'm suggesting that we switch to that method for this pattern. And once you've tried it, I think you'll agree it is much, much easier. Okay, I'm slipping my first stitch as the pattern dictates, and I'm going to knit across the required number of stitches to begin my first short row. Okay, now when you're knitting the German short row, converting it from the wrap and turn method, as in this pattern, it will ask you to knit the required number of stitches and then work a wrap and turn on the next stitch. We're going to eliminate the wrap and turn on the next stitch, and we are going to knit that stitch. So wherever you see a wrap and turn indicated in this pattern, you remember knit one. Okay, we turn the work to the wrong side, and then we have the yarn in the front. We're going to slip the first stitch purlways, and at the same time bring your yarn over the needle to the back of your work to be ready for knitting. So that's the position for knitting at the back. So what I've done, I've tightened up as I've pulled the yarn over my needle, and you can see now one stitch has created 2 bars. That's what you want. And then we just knit across. Wrong side row as the pattern dictates. Okay, I'm back to the right side row. I slip my edge stitch. Now I'm going to show you how to reconcile the wrap stitch. If you're not familiar with doing short rows, you may feel that it's necessary to put a little locking stitch marker on the German short row, your wrap stitch, just so you know that that is where you have to reconcile the yarn over with the stitch. I can see it because it looks a little bit unusual or twisted. So I'm going to knit up to my wrap stitch, and there you can see there are 2 bars coming out of 1 stitch. To reconcile it, all you do is knit the 2 bars together as one. That's it, easy peasy. So we will continue on and do another German short row to demonstrate. Okay, so I've knit the required number of stitches according to the pattern. It tells me to do a wrap and turn on the next stitch, which I am not going to do. I'm going to knit it and then turn and do my German short row technique. Yarn is in front of me. I'm going to slip the first stitch purlways onto the right needle, and at the same time I bring the yarn over the needle to the knit position and tighten it just slightly so I can see that there are 2 bars evident instead of the 1 bar. That tightens up the stitch and it won't leave a hole. And then I knit across to the end of the row. And if you are not familiar with doing short rows, you will build up confidence quickly, because again, it is something you will be doing on pretty much every right side row for the lower panel of the shawl. Slip the first stitch. I'm making that nice slip stitch edge. and then I'm going to knit across, and I'm going to look closely for my wrap stitch to reconcile it. Reconciling just means you're knitting the wrap together with the stitch. Sometimes I can tell by feel when I'm at that stitch, and sometimes I can tell by the appearance. But don't feel too overconfident. If you're not sure what it looks like or what it feels like, please use your locking stitch markers. Clip it on when you actually do the turn, and when you reconcile it, you can take your clip marker off. Okay, so I can see that is my wrap stitch because there are 2 bars coming out of one. So I'm going to knit through the stitch, making sure I catch both bars on my right needle, and then as I come through, the 2 bars become 1 stitch. So in essence, the yarn over wrap is sitting neatly at the back of the stitch, completely invisible. There's no lumps or bumps. The wrap and turn method, which is very standard in patterns, is okay, but there's a lot more work to it, and it does leave a little bit more of a messy stitch. This method is just much more efficient, and since it's a knit along, why not try something to improve your techniques? Okay, so those are all the techniques that you'll be needing to utilize in the knit along project. So we've covered the slip stitch edge, which makes that really pretty finish. Nice and flat, nice and straight. The edge doesn't curl, easy for blocking. And we've covered the CDD, which is the centered double decrease. And on the shawl, that is this line here, getting rid of 2 stitches each time. And then we've also covered the CDI, which is the centered double increase. And that was the make one right, knit 1 in the center for the spine, and then the make 1 left. And then we've covered our short row technique, which hopefully you'll adopt as the German short row instead of the wrap and turn method. So hope you enjoyed that video, and I hope you enjoy the knit along. Thanks for watching, everyone.